Autonomous vehicles have been operating throughout Greater Phoenix for a year plus. They are operating in San Francisco. Last year, Waymo actually was able to work with some outside researchers to compare the accident rate of their cars to the human driver accident rate. And what they found is that autonomous vehicles reduced crashes by about 85%. You're talking about a pretty significant gap there. And unfortunately, in California, a lot of the plans have failed. Traffic fatalities are actually on the increase. And I'm surprised that for as big a problem as the traffic fatality problem is, there are more policymakers who are at least of the view that let's just give this a try.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we're glad to be joined by CEO and founder of the Chamber of Progress, Adam Kovacevich. Adam, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
I know. So we've had Chris McKenzie from your shop on, but not yourself. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to found the Chamber of Progress?
Sure. Well, I'm a Bakersfield native, Central Valley, and my formative experience in politics was working for former Congressman Cal Dooley, who represented the Central Valley. He was one of the founders of the New Democrats in the House in the late
Oh, really?
90s. And yeah, and that was kind of, that was my formative experience because he was one of sort of the pioneering kind of pro-growth pro-tech Democrats, and I kind of became a pro-tech Democrat, and then ended up working in the tech industry a dozen years in Google's Washington office, and have really always considered myself kind of a pro-tech Democrat. And I started Chamber of Progress 3 years ago because I was becoming concerned that more and more Democrats were sort of taking a negative turn against the tech industry that, frankly, I just didn't think what jibed with where a lot of their voters were. And so that was, why I was interested in having more of a conversation among Democrats about kind of the best way forward on tech policy and regulation. So that's what we focus on.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like, we thought we had the dot-com bubble, and we thought that was kind of like the tech pinnacle. And, all of a sudden AI comes in here and, autonomous driving, and all of a sudden, we have, new social medias and networks, and, we're talking about this stuff all again. It's kind of interesting having this second tech boom.
Yeah, and what's always interesting about tech is because it's always pushing the envelope forward. There's always like new policy questions, right, that are going to be debated. And look, let's face it, like tech as an industry is also a very big, important, powerful industry, and it's natural that policymakers are going to have concerns, questions, want to put in place like smart regulations. But my hope is that like the tech regulatory conversation, the tech policy debate, gets to a place where it's as thoughtful as maybe some the way we talk about policy in other more established industries, right? Healthcare, transportation. Like I feel like the tech policy debate is in some ways kind of immature because there's a little bit of like a dynamic of, well, this is a problem, so therefore we have to go through this kind of maximalist solution,
Right.
right? As opposed to having kind of a more nuanced conversation.
It's kind of interesting. Like you mentioned some of these other areas, and for those we have like regulatory agencies, right? For cars, we have the Department of Transportation, and they set regs out and work with automakers on various things. Healthcare, you have the FDA. For tech, there's really nothing. You think there's kind of space for kind of a tech bureaucracy federally to kind of look at this stuff and kind of learn more? Because it kind of seems like we're playing whack-a-mole now. Like something comes up, we don't really know what it is, but we feel we have to do something about it. Yet we don't really know what to do.
Well, I agree with your analysis. I don't totally agree with. There are people who call for like a federal technology agency. I think that when I hear people call for that, I think it's a little bit of a shortcut or shorthand. And actually, what I'd like to see instead is I'd like to see more debate about like what is the problem that a policymaker sees or other people see, and then what is the solution, and then we can figure out if that's something that can be enforced or regulated by a current agency or whether we need to create a new agency. But I feel like sometimes when people say, well, we need a new, technology agency, they're sort of cutting out that middle step of like, what is the problem and what is the solution we want to do about it, as kind of like almost like a shortcut. And I just feel like, look, like we don't take that shortcut in a lot of these other regulatory areas. Let's not take that shortcut when it comes to tech policy either.
It's interesting. I think talking with other people throughout the years, that's kind of what separates, I guess, the United States from other countries, and that's why we have this flourishing tech. Is we have low regulation on tech, right?
Absolutely. Not to mention not just the United States, California. I mean, California is the home to the world's leading technology companies, right?
Right.
And I don't think that happened by accident, and I think it's probably a little underappreciated by probably by some folks in the legislature. That like there's a reason. Like I think sometimes, for example, like one of the things I see, and you see this a lot around bills, legislation proposed around social media. There's sort of a Europe to California pipeline, right? There's a lot of people who are sort of following what Europe's doing in technology policy, and then it gets introduced as bills in California. But it's like,
Right.
look, like California is actually doing it right. Like we're not behind Europe in regulation; we're ahead of them in innovation. And I just think like I would love to see us, take more pride in the fact that California has gotten this balance really right.
Yeah. So it's interesting, like, Tesla is a company that was founded here in California. It's taken off, really kind of brought self-driving and AI driving to the front hole. Now we're seeing all these other companies kind of try autonomous driving and autonomous taxis. I know that's something you're working on. Kind of what's the status of, driverless, taxis here in California?
Yeah. Well, it's important to separate Tesla, which is doing really more like what's called level two or level three autonomy,
Right.
where it's really more of an aid. You're really expected to still be able to take over the car. And with what companies like Waymo and Cruise and Zoox are doing, which is level four, which is really like you're not expected to be able to take over. I remember early on, so I was at Google when Google started working on self driving cars, and one of the first things they did is they asked employees to be like the test drivers, right, for cars like down 101 from San Francisco down to Mountain View. And very quickly what happened is even though the test drivers were told like, don't take your eyes off the road, like you have to be able to take control. The technology kind of lulled drivers into kind of like, just almost kind of like a laziness. Like they started feeling, oh, the technology is pretty good. I can take my eyes off the wheel. I can, comb my hair or whatever. And it was actually the thing that made what became Waymo resolve to pursue full autonomy, which is really nobody has to be able to take over the car. That I think that's the gap that you see emerging between, say, like what Tesla's doing and what fully autonomous companies like Waymo and Cruise and Zoox are doing. So we're at a really interesting point because I think like we now have cities in the United States, particularly Phoenix, San Francisco, and increasingly Los Angeles, where autonomous vehicles are available for hire for ride hailing through an app, and people are using it. And so like we've actually been able to see like what that's actually like, and people are very they really like it for the most part when
Right.
they see it, which is really interesting. The San Francisco Chronicle a couple months ago showed that for all the swirl in San Francisco around the introduction of AVs, like starting from last fall when they were introduced, they were really popular, like really popular. Thousands of rides, thousands of people have taken them. So I think there's a gap between, what maybe the everyday person feels about this and maybe what some of the city leaders feel about it.
So right now we can go to San Francisco and we can download what, the Waymo app
Hmm.
and hail a ride?
Yeah, that's right. You can do it on the Waymo app. You can do this. You've been able to do this in Phoenix for months now, and if I'm not mistaken, LA, it's more of a kind of a just smaller list. You have to be a more like a whitelisted user, but that will be rolling out soon. To LA more broadly.
And are they certain type, are they EVs? Are the
Almost all. I want to say all. I think almost all autonomous vehicles are EVs. Yes.
Oh, interesting. And kinda what's the pricing?
The pricing is comparable to Uber and Lyft. They know. I mean, when you really think about it, like all of the autonomous vehicle companies, when they're sort of looking at markets that they want to be in, they're really looking at Uber and Lyft as like the comparables, and so they know that that's really kind of like their competitor in this
Right.
space, and so they're pricing competitively for that regard.
It was interesting, we used to have taxis, and you used to have to, like, look in the phone book and call a taxi, and then Uber came along and just totally disrupted it, and it was just amazing. You could get, someone to come pick you up any moment, and now that's kind of been disrupted. Here in California, we've had, employment issues and things like that, and there was, all these arguments of, "Oh, the Uber drivers are displacing the taxi cab drivers." Now kinda this talk of, "Oh, these Uber drivers are gonna be displaced by these autonomous vehicles." Kinda what is the conversation and solution around this?
Yeah. Look, I think we ought to be forthright about this, right? Which is that a new technology like autonomous vehicles is going to probably eliminate some driving jobs, right? But I think it will also create a whole new swath of jobs. We're actually doing some research right now, our organization, on what types of jobs and what levels of education those jobs will require, what kind of levels of training. You're talking about software jobs, you're talking about maintenance jobs, you're talking about sort of fleet management jobs, you're talking about all these ancillary jobs. And we want to, look, we are doing research currently to look in a more detailed way about, again, what those jobs actually look like. Our preliminary data shows that those jobs actually will have a higher than median pay. But I also think, candidly, like government probably should be doing a lot more to prepare people for those jobs, right? There are, I think it was Neuro was one of the companies in the AV space had a partnership with community colleges, where they train people through community colleges to become to maintain and repair autonomous vehicles. Like that's a pretty good thing to do. Like we should be encouraging more partnerships like that with community college training, training colleges to prepare people for these jobs. And I think in some ways it'd be great to see policymakers focus more on that and less on what we've seen, which is sort of more like an outright ban, right?
Right.
One of the Teamsters' big priorities last year was a bill banning AV trucking that Governor Newsom vetoed. That bill's back again this year. This year, they've reformed their strategy. There's a new bill from Senator Cortez. It's more about local control.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we had an assembly member on recently talking about that, and it's like I don't know in the 19 hundreds where they trying to outlaw the printing press and some of these other forward things so that people can really do some manual jobs. Yeah, it's kind of when technology happens, jobs get displaced. Kind of what's the sense in fighting that?
Well, I don't want to be laissez-faire about it because I think it's important. Like, I don't think our organization is not of the view that like, well, it's going to happen, so get used to it. Like, our organization is of the view like it is going to happen, so let's prepare for it. Let's make
Right.
smart government investments to prepare for it, and that's the area where I would just love to see more leadership from policymakers. Again, I think that unfortunately the incentives are such that policymakers, again, encouraged I think by labor have adopted more of a position of no. And I think it would be more constructive to adopt a position of like these are going to be here. Let's prepare.
Right. There's a lot of concern about safety with autonomous vehicles. People just
Hmm.
don't trust the technology, which is funny because we'll trust a human who who has failed many a times, and especially with the rise of cell phones and drivers look distracted drivers and things like that. There are a lot more accidents, and kind of San Francisco has always been this kind of ground of bikers fighting for their right to bike on the streets and safety for pedestrians and things like that. Kind of what is the safety track record there in San Francisco compared to, human drivers?
Yeah. So I think this is an area where there's a big, and I would say even understandable gap between like humans' first instinct and then what kind of the data shows over time. So I think humans' first instinct is like, do you want to ride an autonomous vehicle? There's definitely a category of kind of like technology enthusiasts and early adopters like myself who are really excited about that. But then there's a lot, and I know, people who are not excited about that, and they're scared and they're nervous, and the idea of getting an autonomous vehicle is freaky to them. Now, I've ridden in autonomous vehicles probably 3 or 4 times. The experience is always the same. You get in, it's just like kind of magical. You're like, this is crazy. There's no driver there. You punch in your destination, and what you notice within really a matter of minutes is that it becomes almost boring in a period of time, right?
Right.
Because in truth, almost all autonomous vehicles are actually driving more conservatively than human drivers. They're very attuned to the environment, so they all have maps in the back seat, and they're showing you exactly like the pedestrians that are detecting. And I think there's also like, frankly, more adherence. So I saw a video recently on Twitter where there was the San Francisco Fire Department had posted a video about making room for their traffic for their engines, right, when they're rolling down the street with their sirens on and lights on, and Waymo pulled over because it actually is detecting the sirens and the
Right. That's cool.
and the lights. The humans didn't pull over,
Right.
right? And so you just like think, wow, that's really cool. But also, like again, I mentioned earlier, like we've had autonomous vehicles have been operating throughout Greater Phoenix for a year plus. They are operating in San Francisco, and so last year, Waymo actually was able to work with some outside researchers to compare the accident rate of their cars to the human driver accident rate. And what they found is that the autonomous vehicles reduced crashes by about 85%, and that that accounts for sort of underreporting, right, of human driver crashes, right? So, I mean, you're talking about a pretty significant gap there. And one of the things I find interesting is that like a lot of cities have adopted what they call Vision Zero plans, right, to reduce fatalities from traffic. And unfortunately, in California, a lot of those plans have failed. Traffic fatalities are actually on the increase. LA uh, aimed to get traffic fatalities down to zero by 2025, and they're setting new
Wow.
records. And I just think like we have to be realistic. Like a lot of that is because of distracted driving. And that is a problem. Like AVs do not drive drunk; they do not drive distracted. And I just am surprised that there aren't for as big a problem as particularly the traffic fatality problem is, there aren't more policymakers who are at least of the view that let's just give this a try. Let's see what the results are.
Isn't that like the number one cause of death by far and wide of anything here in the nation?
I think so. I think so. And again, even within traffic, I think distracted driving is probably the biggest one.
Yeah. It's interesting. So San Francisco and Phoenix, have been kind of the testing grounds. What's the story of expanding that to other cities?
Oh, I think that the operators would love to expand to more cities. California, it's now presumptively the operators are presumptively allowed to operate to new parts of the state, expand new parts of the state. They have to get approval from the PUC and the DMV. But as I said, Waymo recently got approval to operate throughout Greater LA as well as the San Francisco Peninsula. I expect there to be more operators probably getting permission to do that. And I think that's a great thing, frankly. And unfortunately, the bill by by Assemblymember Cortese would stop that because it would say that if a city doesn't have a AV program in place, the AVs are presumptively illegal. And I think this is an area where local control has failed. Again, it's the cities who've had Vision Zero plans; those have not succeeded. And we've seen in the housing context that local control has not succeeded either. So I think this is an area of transportation is an area where it's appropriate that we regulate at the state level. A lot of transportation roads are between communities and within communities, and I worry a lot that a bill like that could set the state further back when it's actually a leader in autonomous vehicles, and I think will be a leader on safety. I mean, I'm excited for the day a year from now where people in LA are like, you know what? We freaked out a little bit about the AVs, but they're actually pretty cool. And then a year after that, when they say, actually, the accident rate's down, right? That will be amazing. And I think that that's sort of like one of the hopes and dreams that draws a lot of people to work in the autonomous vehicle industry in the first place.
It's kind of, I don't know, it's just, when you're stuck in traffic, right? It's usually because of an accident or distracted drivers or something. Kind of, have you guys looked into how AVs can help, reduce congestion on the highways as well?
Yeah, I don't think AVs don't rubberneck, right? So I think that's probably part of it. There is not yet that many places where AVs have been operating on the highways, but this LA expansion for Waymo will be one of those places, as will their expansion to the peninsula in San Francisco, so south of San Francisco. So I think we'll get more examples of highway driving, which we haven't seen a lot of yet.
Yeah, that'd be a real bummer if, you're expanding the peninsula and all of a sudden a city says, "Oh no, we're going to opt out," and all of a sudden,
Yeah.
the cars have to go around it somehow. It
That's
seems
right.
ridiculous.
Yeah. And that's why I don't think that's the best approach for if you really have optimism that this is a technology that at least ought to be tried and that has the potential to cut down on traffic fatalities and accidents, then that kind of approach where you sort of require each city to come up with their own, autonomous vehicle regulatory regime is not the way to do it, right? And I worked on scooters actually. I worked for Lime scooter company, and that was the approach they took that was adopted for scooters, and I think it limited the rollout and availability of scooters.
Right. It's interesting. So you guys have received some support from advocacy groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving and certain LGBT plus groups. Can you talk about kind of your partnerships with these groups and kind of how you're helping kind of move their messages forward?
Sure. Yeah, I think that this is an area where there are a lot of people who could really stand to benefit, particularly people, older people. AARP is very
Yeah.
involved, MAD's very involved. Many of the blind advocates for the blind have been very involved in supporting the expansion of service by Waymo and Cruise in California, and I think that's great. And it does sort of speak to the fact that a lot of people are really excited about the potential of this. And again, it kind of saddens me that like some of the city officials, both in San Francisco and Los Angeles, haven't again just haven't sort of seen that, or kind of just don't want to see the excitement, the hope that a lot of people have, that this technology just could open up more access for them to the world.
Right. Why do you think there is this kind of like negative incantation towards, AVs and kind of adoption of this?
I think it's a lot of it's about control, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think city departments of transportation are probably still, many of them are still smarting from the advent of rideshare. And rideshare was introduced in a lot of cities in a way, in a kind of an aggressive way, in a way that didn't get their permission. And I think a lot of city departments of transportation adopt the view that like they won't let that kind of thing happen again, kind of on their watch.
Right.
And I also think there's a little bit of an instinct towards like central planning, a favoritism on the part of city transportation departments towards transit, which they run. There's definitely some who have kind of just an antipathy, particularly in San Francisco, have an antipathy towards cars in general. And so they're sort of like more cars is not. So I mean, I think like this is like a little bit of the snapshot of thinking there. And again, I think that my hope again, I think you're already seeing this in San Francisco. Like to me, there's a gap between like what the city leaders were really upset, and I think you saw like the fire department like, almost like actively lobbying against approval of AVs in the city. They were like collecting all these stats on how often fire engines were getting blocked, and they were never collecting any stats about how often human drivers blocked.
Right.
So it was not an apples to apples comparison. And then they stopped collecting it. After they stopped collecting that data after they were approved. So I just think it's a little bit of a fear of the unknown, and maybe a fear of kind of like something that you can't totally, that is not within your own control. Are probably driving those things. So that's some understandable, but I hope that attitude doesn't
Yeah.
prevail across other cities.
It seems like, 5 years ago, the thought of actually having autonomous vehicles being a reality seemed kind of far-fetched. Kinda what is our reality in 5 years? Is this gonna be something commonplace nationwide? Kinda what's the rollout plan?
Oh, I think so, but I will say, I mean, again, this is where like Californians may not fully appreciate that the state is in a leadership position. That could easily go away if the state went the wrong direction on law and policy in this area, but it is in a leadership position, and probably by the end of this year, California will have the most number probably of autonomous vehicles in deployment of any state between San Francisco and Los Angeles. These will be significant expansions. And again, credit to Phoenix and Arizona. They've really led. They've probably been the leader to date in really embracing autonomous vehicles. Unfortunately, you still see some, I would say, pretty traditional states, particularly in the Northeast, that have not yet legalized autonomous vehicles. And I think that they'll be the laggards probably. Um, also as a result of that, we haven't probably seen as much testing of autonomous vehicles in rainy environments and snowy environments.
Yeah, that's what I
And
was wondering,
so
yeah.
yeah, so the fact that most operations have been happening in California and Arizona, like it's been great, but for the technology to be rolled out more broadly, like that's going to probably be there'll be a future step and a future that will involve new technological challenges, right? But in a way, like I think there's a lot of potential there because all of the sensors in autonomous vehicles are really supposed to be a lot better than human sight, and you can imagine a world where sensors are actually giving that vehicle better sight in a snowstorm than a human driver has.
Yeah. Kinda with all this new technology coming about, kinda how does the Chamber of Progress kinda balance innovation with kinda, AV technology with kinda ethical and societal, implications?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, so for example, there was a requirement at the federal level about 2 years ago that all the autonomous vehicle companies report data, and that was something that the industry wasn't crazy about, to be honest. But I think has actually turned out to be a positive because it's shown that the data is really good, the data is really compelling, and so. I think one of the things we try to take the long view on is like not every rule is bad, not every proposed rule is bad. There can be proposed rules that are good and sensible, You look at like airplanes, right? And the fact that we have a system for black boxes in every airplane, and then every time there's an airplane accident, the NTSB can come and look at that black box. That's a really good system, right? So that's actually
Right.
a really good regulation. Um, and so, I'd like to think there's actually a lot of room for practical regulation like that in ways that really make sense. But again, I think, unfortunately, I think a lot of the conversation about this stuff isn't quite like maturing to that level yet, right? It's more like kind of just, oh, we were relaxed for too long, and now we have to be really punitive and limiting, rather than like, how are we going to live with this technology? And I think that's a stage I'd love to see. We'd like to help policymakers get to, which is like, how do we live with this technology?
It's interesting. It's been so rapidly evolving. You just kind of see how different radars, lidars, and so forth, camera technology, and so forth, changing rapidly year in year and out. It should be interesting to see where we are in a few years.
Absolutely.
Well, Adam, thanks again for joining us. Always great talking to you and learning more what the chamber is doing. What's the best way to our listeners to reach out to you and find out more information about the chamber and what you're working on?
Sure. We're on the web at progresschamber.org and Progress Chamber on Twitter. And then I am on Twitter at Adam Kovac. I guess we're
All right.
supposed to be calling it X, but I still call it Twitter.
It was funny. My son's baseball team was doing a chant about Twitter and tweeting, and I was like, "So it's X? Is it still called a tweet? What is it called now?" But
The world's worst rebrand.
yeah,
We're still calling it the old thing.
exactly, exactly. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us, and a pleasure learning more about AVs, and looking forward to talking to you guys more in the future.
Yeah, great to talk with you.
Awesome. Thanks.